June 14, 1864. Pine Mountain, Georgia. A Confederate general climbs a ridge to get a better look at enemy lines. He's wearing a full dress uniform. Around his neck, a pectoral cross. Moments later, a Union cannon fires. The shell tears through his chest. The men who watched him die weren't just losing a general. Many of them knew they were losing their bishop, and a tangible link to God. This is the story of Leonidas Polk, the man who commanded Confederate armies and consecrated churches, who baptized soldiers between battles, and who built his entire life on an institution that contradicted what he preached on Sunday. Leonidas Polk was born in 1806 in Raleigh, North Carolina, into wealth and privilege. Like many young men of his social class, he was sent to West Point, and he did well there, well enough that everyone assumed he was headed for a military career. Then something happened that nobody expected. During a chapel service on campus, Polk had a religious conversion. Not long after graduating, he did something almost unheard of for a West Point man. He walked away from the army entirely and went into the ministry. He studied theology in Virginia, was ordained an Episcopal priest, and by 1841 he was Bishop of Louisiana, a position he'd hold for the rest of his life, even after he put a uniform back on. But here's the thing. People often leave out of the man of God version of this story that Polk wasn't just a bishop. He was one of the wealthiest planters in the South. Polk ran cotton plantations across Louisiana and Mississippi. At his peak, he enslaved several hundred people. By some estimates, over 400 across his properties. This wasn't incidental to his life. It was the financial foundation of it. And Polk wasn't quiet about defending the system that made him rich. He preached that slavery was compatible with Christianity, even that it was a positive good, a civilizing and Christianizing institution. He helped found the University of the South at Sewanee, explicitly envisioned as a school to train the sons of the Southern planter elite, insulated from Northern abolitionist influence. Polk didn't just defend slavery as an economic necessity, he wrapped it in the language of duty. He saw himself as a paternalistic patriarch, personally responsible for the souls of the people he enslaved. On his Louisiana plantation, he hired a priest specifically to preach to the enslaved and ran a Sunday school on the property. He restricted enslaved people from working on the Sabbath and personally presided over wedding ceremonies for them inside the plantation's big house. In his own mind, Christianizing enslaved people wasn't in tension with owning them, it was the justification for owning them. He genuinely seems to have believed emancipation would come someday, gradually, on his terms. Just not now, and not because anyone was entitled to demand it. But hold that image up against the rest of the record, and it falls apart fast. As a young man, Polk once bragged in a letter to his own father about personally whipping a group of enslaved workers who'd protested a threatened flogging, writing afterward that they'd been quiet ever since. This letter remains preserved and is considered among history's primary sources on Polk's thoughts on slavery. Later in life, he complained that the very people whose forced labor built his family's fortune were lazy and careless. The kindly, Christianizing patriarch was also a man capable of casual cruelty and contempt for the people he claimed to be shepherding. Paternalism wasn't a softer alternative to white supremacy. For Polk, it was the packaging white supremacy came in. Sit with that contradiction for a second. This is a man who spent his Sundays telling congregations about a gospel of universal human dignity, and spent his weekdays running plantations built on stealing the labor, families, and freedom of hundreds of human beings. Polk wasn't unusual among Southern clergy in this. Plenty of Southern churches built elaborate theological defenses of slavery. But few embodied the contradiction as literally as a man who was, at once, a bishop and one of the region's major enslavers. When the Civil War broke out in 1861, Polk's old West Point classmate, now Confederate President Jefferson Davis, came calling. Davis wanted Polk as a general. Polk hadn't worn a uniform in 3 decades. He accepted anyway, and kept his bishopric the entire time. Soldiers started calling him the Fighting Bishop. His very first major decision as a Confederate commander was arguably one of the worst in the war. Kentucky had declared itself neutral, But he chose to violate this neutrality. Polk unilaterally ordered his troops to occupy Columbus, Kentucky, and in doing so, handed the Union a gift. Kentucky's neutrality collapsed, and the state tilted toward the Union almost immediately. It's one of the great, what if he hadn't, moments of the early war. And yet, his soldiers adored him. This is the part that's hard to reconcile if you only think of Polk as a slaveholder wearing a general's coat. To the men in the ranks, he was something else entirely. He walked among the camps in his clerical collar. He preached to them. He baptized soldiers, including, famously, fellow generals like John Bell Hood, Joseph Johnston, and William Hardy, in makeshift ceremonies between campaigns. In an army full of homesick, frightened, often devout young men facing death daily, Polk offered something most generals couldn't: the sense that God was walking with them. He was also physically brave, genuinely fearless under fire, which soldiers respected deeply, whatever you think of his cause. At Perryville, at Stone's River, at Chickamauga, he was out front with his men, not hiding behind the lines. But bravery and popularity didn't make him a good general. And that gap, beloved by his men, distrusted by his superiors, became the defining tension of his military career. Here's where Polk's story gets genuinely toxic for the Confederate war effort, not because of the Union, but because of infighting. And this rivalry didn't come out of nowhere. It went back to the very start of the war, when Davis controversially made Polk, a man with no recent military experience, a major general. Braxton Bragg, who was promoted to full general in April 1862, frequently clashed with Polk over tactical decisions and delayed orders, notably at the battles of Perryville and Chickamauga. The first real crisis came after the Battle of Stone's River, in January 1863. Bragg had fought Rosecrans's army to a tactical draw and then withdrew, a defensible decision given his supply situation, but one his own general used as ammunition against him. Polk petitioned Jefferson Davis directly, demanding Bragg be removed from command. At Tullahoma that summer, Bragg had dug his army into a fortified position. Hardee, one of his corps commanders, initially supported the strategy of making a stand. However, the loudest voice pushing for a retreat was Polk. He argued that the Union's flanking maneuvers, the swollen Elk River, and exposed flank made holding the position untenable. Despite his differences with Polk, Bragg sided with the fighting bishop and withdrew even before being seriously attacked. Most historians agree this was the right tactical decision, but giving up Middle Tennessee without a real fight handed a major strategic and psychological victory to the Union at a minimal cost. This also damaged Bragg's standing. The breaking point came at Chickamauga 2 months later. Ironically, a Confederate victory. Bragg ordered Polk to launch a dawn attack on September 20, 1863, that could have destroyed a large chunk of the disorganized Union army. Polk delayed for hours. By the time his men finally moved, the Union defenders under George Thomas had had time to dig in on Snodgrass Hill, a stand that earned Thomas the nickname, the Rock of Chickamauga, and let the rest of Rosecrans's army escape into Chattanooga. Bragg was furious, and rightly so. He officially relieved Polk of his command of the Army of Tennessee. Polk later demanded a court-martial to clear his name. However, Bragg was not a popular commander, and this action outraged other senior officers and led to a revolt of the generals. Almost the entire senior command of the Army of Tennessee wanted their own commanding general gone. Generals such as Simon Bolivar Buckner, D.H. Hill, and Nathan Bedford Forrest petitioned Confederate President Davis, accusing Bragg of incompetence and demanding his immediate removal. James Longstreet, who'd only just arrived from Lee's army in Virginia, was stunned by what he found. He'd later write that it felt like only divine intervention could save an army led by Bragg. Davis kept Bragg anyway. And Bragg didn't forget who'd turned on him. Within weeks, he'd rid the rebellious generals such as Hill and Buckner of their commands, purging the very men who'd voted against him. As Davis put it to the army on his way out, sowing discontent and distrust in an army just prepares it for slaughter and defeat. He wasn't wrong. He just didn't stop it from happening. This is the real story underneath the individual battles. An army whose senior leadership trusted each other less with every month that passed. And Polk wasn't some neutral party caught in the crossfire. He was one of the main instigators. A different kind of general, a steadier hand, might have used his rank and his moral authority as a bishop to hold that command structure together. Polk did the opposite. Time and again, he was a driving force in the discord, not a check on it, and an army that distrusts its own leadership top to bottom doesn't have much chance against Sherman. By 1864, Polk was serving under a different commander, Joseph E. Johnston, during the Atlanta campaign. For a change, Polk and Johnston didn't have the toxic rivalry Polk had with Bragg. If anything, they got along. But Polk's death still mattered enormously for that campaign, just not because of a feud. Johnston was trying to fight a slow, defensive campaign, trading space for time, wearing Sherman down before he could take Atlanta. Polk was one of his 3 corps commanders, an experienced hand Johnston relied on. When Polk was killed at Pine Mountain, Johnston lost a capable, trusted general in the middle of an already difficult retreat. Combined with the chronic command instability that had plagued this army under Bragg for years, feuds, mistrust, a revolving door of blame, the Army of Tennessee simply never had the internal cohesion it needed to stop Sherman. Atlanta fell that September. Polk didn't live to see it. But the dysfunction he'd both suffered from and contributed to under Bragg, and the gap his death left under Johnston, were both threads in that larger unraveling. So how do you sum up a man like this? He was, by most military historians' assessments, a mediocre general, brave, beloved, but tactically unreliable and prone to insubordination. He was, by any honest reckoning, a man who built his wealth and his university on slavery, and who used his pulpit to defend it. And he was, by the accounts of the men who served under him, a genuinely comforting spiritual presence in the middle of a brutal war. That contradiction hasn't gone away. Sewanee, the university he helped found, has spent recent years publicly reckoning with his legacy, debating memorials and renamings tied to his role as an enslaver. Leonidas Polk wasn't just a strange footnote, a bishop who happened to fight. He's a distillation of something much bigger. How deeply Christianity and slavery were entangled in the antebellum South, and how a man could be, sincerely, both a shepherd and an owner of human beings. If you want more stories like this, where American history gets a lot more complicated than the textbook version, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.